Mira didn't know that the bleeding stranger she was bandaging in her hidden healing cottage was the most powerful alpha in the realm. She didn't know that his wounds came from assassins sent by his own council. And she certainly didn't know that the moment his silver eyes met hers, he'd recognized her as his fated mate. The storm had been raging for 3 hours when she heard the collapse outside her door. Thunder masked the sound of a body hitting the muddy ground, but something in her chest pulled tight, urgent and impossible to ignore. Mira pressed her face to the rain-streaked window, peering into the darkness beyond her cottage's protective wards. A man lay crumpled beneath the ancient oak tree, his dark hair plastered against his skull by the driving rain. Blood mixed with mud beneath him, creating a spreading pool that the storm couldn't wash away fast enough. Every survival instinct she had developed over 3 years of hiding screamed at her to bar the door, to let the forest claim another victim. She opened the door anyway. The stranger was massive, broader through the shoulders than any man she had ever seen. His clothes, though torn and bloodied, were fine-quality leather and wool that spoke of wealth, of power she wanted nothing to do with. When she rolled him onto his back, checking for breath, his face stopped her cold. Beautiful, devastatingly, impossibly beautiful, in a way that made her hands shake as she pressed them to the worst of his wounds. High cheekbones, a strong jaw shadowed with dark stubble, lips that would have been perfect if they weren't grey with blood loss. This was not a man who belonged in her world, but he was dying. Mira dragged him inside through sheer determination and terror-fueled strength, her bare feet slipping on the wet stone threshold. His body was dead weight, warm and solid, and so much larger than her small frame should have been able to manage. By the time she got him onto her narrow bed, her lungs burned, and her healing magic hummed beneath her skin, responding to his pain. The wounds were precise, deliberate. 3 knife cuts designed to kill slowly, to cause maximum suffering. The work of someone who enjoyed their craft. Mira's stomach turned as she cut away his ruined shirt, revealing a torso that was all lean muscle and battle scars. This man was a warrior, and someone had wanted him to suffer. She worked by candlelight, her hands steady despite the storm still raging outside, and the voice in her head that whispered she was a fool for helping him. Her healing magic flowed through her fingertips, knitting flesh back together, coaxing his body to remember wholeness. It had been months since she had used her power on anything more serious than a merchant's infected cut, and the drain left her dizzy. When the worst of the bleeding stopped, when his breathing deepened from harsh gasps to something steady and strong, Mira allowed herself to truly look at him. Even unconscious, even pale from blood loss, power radiated from him like heat from a forge. There was something about the way he held himself, even in sleep, that spoke of command, of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Dangerous. Everything about him screamed dangerous. His eyes opened as she pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. Silver. Not grey, not pale blue, but true silver like moonlight on water. They fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, made something deep in her chest respond with a golden warmth she had never felt before. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they simply stared at each other while the storm raged beyond her walls. When he tried to sit up, Mira pressed a firm hand to his chest. The contact sent heat shooting up her arm, spreading through her body like wildfire. She jerked back as if burned, but his hand caught her wrist, gentle but inescapable. Easy. His voice was rough from pain and unconsciousness, but there was something in it that made her want to listen, to trust, to lean into the warmth that seemed to emanate from his very skin. "I won't hurt you." The words should have been meaningless. Every man who had ever hurt her had said similar things. But when he spoke them, something in her chest settled. Some part of her that had been running for 3 years finally went still. "You were dying," she whispered, because she needed to say something, needed to fill the space between them with words, instead of the strange electricity that made her skin feel too tight. "Outside in the storm. I couldn't just leave you." His silver eyes never left her face. "You saved me." "I'm a healer. It's what I do." The lie came easily. She wasn't a healer, not really. She was a survivor, a girl with dangerous magic who sold harmless remedies to travellers and hid from the world that wanted her dead. No. His thumb brushed over her pulse point, and she couldn't help but notice how perfectly her wrist fit in his large hand. "You chose to save me. There's a difference." Something about the way he said it made her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. When was the last time anyone had thanked her for anything? When was the last time anyone had looked at her like she mattered? "What's your name?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. Names made things real, made them complicated. "Kieran." He watched her face as if searching for recognition, but the name meant nothing to her. She had been isolated too long, cut off from news of the wider world. "And you, little healer?" "Mira." The endearment sent warmth curling through her stomach. Little healer, as if she were something precious, something to be protected rather than feared. "Mira," he repeated, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer. "Thank you." She wanted to pull away, to retreat to the safety of distance and suspicion, but his hand on her wrist kept her anchored. The storm outside had begun to quiet, rain gentling from driving sheets to a steady patter against her windows. Dawn was still hours away, but something in the quality of darkness had shifted. "You need rest," she said, though she made no move to leave his side. "Your body needs time to heal. Will you stay?" The question was quiet, vulnerable in a way that didn't match the power she sensed in him. "Just until the storm ends?" Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was how it started. This was how women like her got hurt, got used, got discarded when the powerful grew bored. But the golden warmth in her chest pulsed stronger, and something about the way he held her wrist, gentle but desperate, made her chest ache. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Scared of trusting him, scared of wanting to trust him, scared of the way her body seemed to recognize his in ways that defied explanation. His entire expression softened, silver eyes going warm and gentle. The transformation was startling, turning him from dangerous stranger to something infinitely tender. "Then we go slow," he murmured, his voice carrying a promise that made her chest tight. "I'm not leaving." Outside, thunder rolled across the sky one last time, before the storm moved on, leaving only the gentle patter of rain and the sound of two people breathing in the candle-lit darkness. Mira didn't pull away from his touch, didn't retreat to her chair by the fire. Instead, she settled beside his bed, her hand still caught in his gentle grip, and for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't running. She was choosing to stay. The days that followed were a strange rhythm of healing and discovery. Kieran slept deeply for the first day and night, his body surrendering to exhaustion and the lingering effects of blood loss. Mira found herself checking on him far more often than necessary, drawn by some invisible thread that pulled her to his bedside every few hours. When he woke on the second morning, sunlight streaming through her small windows and painting everything gold, he watched her prepare breakfast with those impossible silver eyes. She could feel his gaze like a physical touch as she moved around her tiny kitchen, measuring herbs for tea and slicing bread with hands that trembled just slightly under his attention. "You don't have to stay in bed," she said without turning around, though something warm and pleased curled in her stomach at the thought of him watching her. "The worst of your injuries have healed. I like watching you." The honesty in his voice made her breath catch. No pretense, no games, just simple truth that made her chest tight with something she couldn't name. She turned to find him propped up on one elbow, dark hair falling across his forehead, and those silver eyes warm with something that looked dangerously like affection. He was beautiful in the morning light, all sharp angles and lean muscle, but there was a gentleness in his expression that made her feel precious rather than hunted. "You don't know anything about me," she whispered, setting down the bread knife with hands that weren't quite steady. I know you saved a stranger's life in the middle of a storm. He sat up slowly, testing his strength, and she had to resist the urge to rush to his side. I know you have magic that could heal wounds that should have killed me. I know you live alone and you're afraid of something. The accuracy of his observations made her stomach flip. That's not knowing me, that's observing. Then tell me. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, and she couldn't help but notice how small her cottage seemed with him in it, how his presence filled every corner. Tell me who you are, little healer. That endearment again, spoken with such warmth that it made her chest ache. She wanted to tell him everything and nothing, wanted to trust him and wanted to run. Instead, she poured tea into 2 chipped ceramic cups and tried to find words for a story she had never told anyone. Mira Thornwick, she said finally, settling into the chair across from where he had moved to sit at her small table. Daughter of nobody important, granddaughter of a woman who saw things before they happened and died for the gift. He accepted the tea with careful hands, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. The contact sent familiar heat up her arm, but she didn't pull away this time. Magic runs in your family. Ran, she corrected, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. The mage hunters made sure of that 3 years ago. Something dark flickered across his features. They came to your village. It wasn't a question. He knew about the purges, about the systematic hunting of anyone with magical ability. Most people did, though they rarely spoke of it aloud. Ravenshire, she whispered, the name of her destroyed home falling from her lips like a funeral prayer. They said we were harbouring dangerous criminals. They said magic was a corruption that needed to be cleansed. Her hands tightened around her teacup until her knuckles went white. They burned the houses while people were still inside. Kieran's jaw tightened, and she caught a glimpse of something fierce and protective in his silver eyes before he banked it. You escaped. I ran. The admission tasted like shame. I heard the screams and I ran into the forest like a coward while my neighbours died. You survived. His voice was firm, brooking no argument. There's no shame in surviving, Mira. The way he said her name, like it was something sacred, made tears burn behind her eyes. She had told herself the same thing countless times over the past 3 years, but she had never quite believed it. Coming from him, it sounded almost like truth. I've been hiding ever since, she continued, needing to finish the story now that she had started. Moving from place to place, selling harmless remedies to travellers, never staying anywhere long enough to be remembered. But you stopped here. The cottage was abandoned. The family who owned it died of plague 2 winters ago. She gestured to the simple space around them, with its herb bundles and carefully tended garden visible through the windows. It felt safe, hidden. I thought I could finally stop running. You can. His hand covered hers across the table, warm and steady and impossibly gentle. You are safe, Mira. She wanted to believe him, wanted to sink into the certainty in his voice, but 3 years of survival had taught her that safety was an illusion. You don't know that. You don't know what they'll do if they find me. They won't. The quiet confidence in his voice made her look up, made her really look at him. There was something in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, that spoke of power she hadn't fully recognised before. Who are you? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Really, I mean, you're not just some traveller who got caught by bandits. Something shifted in his expression, a careful blankness that made her suddenly intensely aware that she knew nothing about the man she had saved, the man whose presence filled her cottage like he belonged there. I'm someone who can keep you safe, he said finally, which wasn't an answer at all. Before she could press him further, he was moving, standing with fluid grace that spoke of a warrior's training. Let me help you with something, please. The request, so politely worded, made her chest flutter with something warm and pleased. She nodded toward the cottage's small garden visible through the back window. The storm damaged some of the support stakes for my herb plants. Working beside him in her garden felt like the most natural thing in the world. His hands were gentle with her plants, careful not to damage the delicate stems as he repositioned the wooden stakes and retied the hemp rope that held everything in place. She found herself stealing glances at him as they worked, at the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, and the focused concentration on his face as he coaxed a broken lavender stem back to uprightness. "You're good with growing things," she observed, settling back on her heels to watch him work. "My mother had gardens," he said quietly, something wistful in his voice. "Before she died, she used to say that anything could flourish if you gave it enough patience and care." The grief in his tone made her chest ache in sympathy. "How old were you?" 12. His hands stilled on the plant he was tending. Old enough to remember her, young enough to feel lost without her guidance. "And your father?" "Gone by the time I was 15. He finished securing the lavender and moved on to a patch of chamomile that had been battered by the storm. "I learned early that survival meant relying only on yourself." "I know what it feels like to be alone in a room full of people," she whispered, echoing his earlier sentiment about understanding isolation. He looked up at that, silver eyes finding hers across the small garden space. "Do you? Really? Even before the hunters came, I was different. Magic makes people nervous, makes them watch you like you might explode at any moment." She pulled absently at a weed, needing something to do with her hands under his intense gaze. "I spent most of my childhood trying to be invisible." "You could never be invisible." The certainty in his voice made her pulse quicken. "Not to anyone who matters." The way he was looking at her, like she was something rare and precious, made heat pool in her stomach. She had never been looked at like that, like she was worth treasuring instead of fearing. "Kieran," she started, then stopped, unsure what she wanted to say. He was closer suddenly, having moved across the small space between them without her noticing. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing over her skin with devastating gentleness. "I lost my parents young too," he said softly. "I understand the weight of survival, Mira. I understand what it costs to keep going when everything you knew is gone." The shared understanding in his words, the recognition of her pain reflected in his silver eyes, cracked something open in her chest. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel completely alone. "Thank you," she whispered, leaning slightly into his touch before she could stop herself. "For what?" "For staying, for not making me feel like something to be feared." His thumb traced her cheekbone with impossible tenderness. "Little healer," he murmured, and the endearment sent warmth spiraling through her entire body. "You are something to be treasured, not feared." The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with something electric and inevitable. She could see flecks of steel in his silver eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Another moment and he might kiss her, might close the distance that felt both too much and not nearly enough. Instead, he pulled back, his hand dropping from her face with what looked like genuine reluctance. "We should go inside," he said, voice slightly rough. "The sun is getting strong." She nodded, though part of her wanted to protest, wanted to stay in this moment where possibility hung between them like morning mist. They gathered their tools in comfortable silence, and she found herself hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every brush of his fingers against hers. That evening, as they shared a simple dinner by the fire, Kieran told her about losing his parents, about the loneliness that came with responsibility he couldn't share with anyone. She found herself opening up in return, sharing memories of her grandmother's stories and her mother's laughter, things she hadn't spoken of since the night Ravenshire burned. "What shall I call you, little healer?" he asked as she banked the fire for the night, his voice warm with something that sounded dangerously like affection. "Mira," she said, confused by the question. "I know your name." His smile was soft, intimate in the firelight. "I meant, what would you like me to call you when we're alone like this?" The question implied a future, implied more evenings by the fire and quiet conversations in her garden. It implied that he planned to stay, At least for a while. Just Mira, she whispered, though her heart whispered other possibilities. Beloved, precious, mine. Just Mira, he agreed. But the way he said her name made it sound like an endearment all on its own. That night she lay in the small bed she had given him while she took the chair by the dying fire and listened to him breathe in the darkness. The golden warmth in her chest had settled into something steady and sure, a constant reminder of his presence just a few feet away. For the first time since Ravenshire, she fell asleep without checking the locks on her door. 3 days became a week, and the rhythm of their shared existence settled into something that felt dangerously close to belonging. Mira woke each morning to find Kieran already up, tending the fire or preparing tea with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in her space. The sight of him moving through her cottage, dark hair catching the early light, and those impossible silver eyes warm with something that looked like contentment, made her chest tight with emotions she wasn't ready to name. But something had shifted between them since their conversation in the garden. A carefulness had crept into their interactions, a polite distance that felt wrong after the intimacy of shared stories and gentle touches. Mira found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, cataloguing the way he held himself, the unconscious authority in his posture that spoke of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You're thinking too much, little healer," Kieran said, from where he sat across from her at the small table, making her realise she had been staring into her tea instead of drinking it. "I'm always thinking too much," she replied, but she couldn't quite meet his eyes. Something about his presence this morning felt different, more intense, like he was studying her as carefully as she had been studying him. About what? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities she wasn't brave enough to voice, about the way her body responded to his nearness, about the golden warmth in her chest that pulsed stronger every day, about the fact that she was falling for a man whose last name she didn't even know. "About how this ends," she said instead, which was true enough to not feel like a lie. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Does it have to end?" The careful hope in his voice made her look up, made her really see the expression on his face. There was vulnerability there, hidden beneath the confident mask he wore like armour, and it made her chest ache with the urge to reach for him. "Everything ends eventually," she whispered, though part of her desperately wanted him to prove her wrong. "Not everything." He leaned forward, silver eyes intense on her face. "Some things are worth fighting for, worth building something lasting." The way he was looking at her, like she might be one of those things worth fighting for, made heat pool in her stomach. But before she could find words to respond, before she could even begin to process what he might mean, a sound from outside made them both freeze. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast, coming straight toward her cottage. Terror slammed through Mira's system like ice water. In 3 years of hiding, no one had ever approached her cottage with such purpose, such speed. Her hands began to shake as she stood, the teacup slipping from nerveless fingers to shatter on the wooden floor. Mira. Kieran was on his feet instantly, moving with fluid grace toward the window. "How many people know about this place?" "No one," she whispered, backing toward the cottage's rear door. Every instinct she had developed over 3 years of survival screamed at her to run, to disappear into the forest before whoever was coming could see her face. "No one knows I'm here." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Someone had found her. Someone was coming, and the only reason people came looking for girls like her was to drag them away in chains. Kieran peered through the window, and something in his posture went deadly still. When he turned back to her, his entire demeanour had shifted. Gone was the gentle man who had shared her breakfast table, replaced by something predatory and fierce. "Stay behind me," he said, voice carrying an authority that made her want to obey without question. "I need to run," she said instead, her voice barely above a whisper. "If they're mage hunters, they're not." The certainty in his voice stopped her in her tracks. "Trust me, Mira. Stay behind me." Before she could ask how he could possibly know who was approaching, before she could demand answers to the questions that had been building for days, the cottage door burst open without ceremony. 3 men in royal colours stepped inside, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Guards. Not mage hunters, but royal guards with the silver wolf crest embroidered on their leather armour. Mira's confusion lasted exactly as long as it took her to see their reaction to Kieran. All 3 men immediately dropped to one knee, heads bowed in perfect synchronization. "Your Majesty," the lead guard said, his voice carefully neutral. "We've been searching for you." "Your Majesty." The words hit Mira like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and making her vision blur at the edges. She watched in horrified fascination as Kieran transformed before her eyes, his shoulders squaring and his entire presence expanding to fill the room in a way that spoke of absolute power. "Rise," he said, and even his voice was different, colder, commanding. This was not the man who had helped her tend her garden, who had shared stories by her fire. This was someone else entirely. "Kieran," she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a prayer or a curse. He turned to her, and she saw the exact moment he realized what his deception had cost them. His silver eyes, warm with affection just moments before, now held something that looked dangerously close to desperation. "Mira, you're the Alpha King." The words came out flat, emotionless, though inside her chest something was cracking apart with a sound like breaking glass. "Yes." No denial, no attempt to soften the truth. Just simple acknowledgement that made her stomach turn with betrayal. The most powerful alpha in the realm. The man who commanded armies, who could have anyone and anything he wanted. The man who had been lying to her since the moment she saved his life. "My lord," the guard interrupted carefully, "we need to return to the capital immediately. The council is demanding answers about your disappearance." Kieran's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away from Mira's face. "Give me a moment with the lady." "My lord, with respect, we don't have time." "I said give me a moment." The command cracked through the air like a whip, and all 3 guards immediately stepped outside. Even through her shock and betrayal, Mira couldn't help but notice how quickly they obeyed, how absolute his authority was over them. The silence that followed their exit stretched between them like a chasm. Mira backed toward the rear door, needing distance, needing space to think past the roaring in her ears. "You lied to me," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded when everything inside her felt like it was falling apart. "I never lied." His voice was gentle now, all traces of royal command gone, as if he could slip back into being the man she thought she knew. "I just didn't tell you everything. The same thing." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the morning warmth. "You let me tell you about hiding, about running from people with power, while you were exactly the kind of man I've been afraid of." "I'm not." "You are." The words came out sharp, cutting. "You're the Alpha King. You have more power than anyone in the realm, and you've been playing games with a peasant girl who was stupid enough to save your life." Something fierce flashed in his silver eyes. "Don't call yourself that. Don't diminish what you are." "What I am." She laughed, and it sounded bitter even to her own ears. "I'm nobody. I'm a hedge witch hiding in a cottage, and you're a king. You want to tell me that's not exactly what this is?" "You're my—" He stopped himself, jaw clenching as if he had been about to say something he couldn't take back. "You're what?" she demanded, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. For a moment she thought he might tell her. She saw it in his face, the urge to say something that would change everything between them. But then his shoulders straightened, and she saw him retreat behind the careful mask of royalty. "I need to go," he said instead, and the non-answer felt like another betrayal. "Yes," she agreed, backing another step toward the door. "You do." "Mira?" Her name in his voice held a desperate edge that made her chest tighten. "This doesn't change anything. What's between us?" "There is nothing between us." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, but she forced it out anyway. There's a king and a peasant who briefly shared a cottage, that's all. You don't mean that. Don't I? She lifted her chin, calling on 3 years of survival to armour herself against the hurt in his silver eyes. Go back to your capital, your majesty. Go back to your real life. He took a step toward her, and she saw the man she had been falling for flicker back to life in his expression. Mira, please, let me explain. Explain what? That you were slumming with a nobody while you recovered? That this was all some kind of game to you? She shook her head, backing toward the door again. I understand perfectly. My lord, the guard's voice came through the door, carefully respectful, but insistent. We really must depart. Kieran's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment he looked like he might tell his guards to wait, might choose her over duty and politics and whatever was calling him back to his throne. But then his shoulders squared again, and she saw him make his choice. I'll come back, he said, the words carrying the weight of a promise. This isn't over, Mira. Yes, it is. She turned away from him, focusing on the herb bundles hanging by her kitchen window rather than the man who had just shattered her carefully rebuilt world. Goodbye, Your Majesty. She heard him move toward the door, heard him stop in the threshold, as if he wanted to say something else. But then the footsteps retreated, and she heard the sound of horses departing, taking Kieran away from her cottage and back to the life where he belonged. Only then did she allow herself to sink to the floor, her back against the kitchen wall, and let the tears come. The golden warmth in her chest felt cold now, empty, like something precious had been torn away without warning. She had been right all along. Powerful men were dangerous, even the ones who seemed gentle, even the ones who made you feel safe, especially those ones. But even as she cried, even as she told herself she was better off alone, part of her chest ached with the memory of silver eyes and gentle hands and a voice calling her little healer, like she was something to be treasured. She was scared. She was scared of how much she already missed him, scared of how empty her cottage felt without his presence, scared of the part of her that wanted him to keep his promise and come back. Most of all, she was scared of how much she had wanted him to choose her over his crown, even knowing it was impossible. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, and Mira sat alone on her kitchen floor and tried to remember what safety felt like before it wore a pair of silver eyes and a smile that made her believe in things that could never be. The weeks that followed were the longest of Mira's life. Days blurred together in a haze of empty routine as she tried to convince herself that Kieran's departure was a blessing, that she was better off alone. She tended her garden with mechanical precision, prepared her remedies with hands that shook only slightly, and told herself that the hollow ache in her chest would fade with time. It didn't. Every morning she woke hoping the golden warmth that had settled in her chest during his stay would finally be gone, that she would feel like herself again. Instead, it pulsed like a second heartbeat, a constant reminder of silver eyes and gentle hands, and a voice that called her precious. She was preparing to harvest the last of her summer herbs when she heard the hoofbeats again. This time she didn't freeze. 3 weeks of missing him had taught her that running wouldn't solve anything, that the ache in her chest would follow her no matter how far she went. Instead, she straightened from where she knelt in her garden and waited. Kieran rode alone this time, no royal guards flanking him, no ceremony or pomp. Just a man on horseback picking his way carefully through the forest paths toward her cottage. Even from a distance she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like he expected her to disappear the moment he appeared. He dismounted at the edge of her garden, silver eyes finding hers across the small space with an intensity that made her breath catch. He looked tired, she realized. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before, a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. Little healer. he said softly, and the endearment sent warmth spiralling through her chest, despite her best efforts to remain unmoved. "Your Majesty," she replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral, even as something in her chest sang at the sight of him. He flinched at the title like it was a physical blow. "Don't! Please don't call me that." "It's what you are." She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, with movements that felt stiff and unnatural. "You're the Alpha King, and I'm nobody. We both know where that puts us." "You're not nobody." The fierce certainty in his voice made her look up despite herself. "You're everything, Mira. You're—" "Stop!" The word came out sharper than she intended, edged with 3 weeks of pain and loneliness. "Just stop. You don't get to come back here and say things like that." "Why not?" He took a step closer, and she caught the scent of him on the breeze, leather and pine, and something uniquely male that made her body respond in ways she desperately wanted to ignore. "Because it's not real." The words tasted bitter, but she forced them out anyway. "Because you're a king, and I'm a peasant with dangerous magic, and fairy tales don't exist." "This isn't a fairy tale." Another step closer, and now she could see the flecks of steel in his silver eyes, could see the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides like he was fighting the urge to reach for her. "This is us. This is real." "Is it?" She lifted her chin, calling on every ounce of strength she had developed over 3 years of survival. "Or is this just a king's fancy that will pass when the next pretty thing catches your eye?" The hurt that flashed across his features was so genuine, so raw, that it almost broke her resolve. Almost. "You think that's what this is?" His voice was quiet, dangerous in a way that made her pulse quicken. "You think I would ride alone through hostile territory, abandon my duties, face a council in full rebellion for a passing fancy?" The words hit her like cold water, making her realize what she had been too hurt to notice before. He had come alone, had risked his safety to return to her. He looked exhausted, looked like a man who had been fighting battles she couldn't even imagine. "What do you mean, rebellion?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. His jaw tightened, and she saw him debate how much to tell her. "Half my council believes I'm unfit to rule. They think my disappearance proves I'm too unstable to lead the realm." "Because you were wounded by assassins?" The injustice of it made anger flare in her chest, hot and protective. "Because I refuse to name a queen from their approved list of political alliances." His eyes never left her face, and there was something in his expression that made her chest tight with possibilities she didn't dare name. "Because I keep making excuses to delay the marriage negotiations they've been pushing for months." The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. "Why would you—" "Because my mate isn't on their list." The words hung between them like a confession, loaded with meaning that made her breath catch. Mate. He had said it before, in moments of passion or protection, but she had told herself it was just a word, just something men like him said to women like her. But the way he was looking at her now, with something that looked dangerously close to devotion, made her chest tight with hope she couldn't afford. "I'm not your mate," she whispered, though something deep inside her chest pulsed with golden warmth that called her a liar. Aren't you?" He was closer now, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his silver eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "Tell me you didn't feel it the moment I touched you. Tell me there isn't something in your chest that recognizes me." She wanted to lie, wanted to protect herself from the possibility of more heartbreak, but the words wouldn't come, because she had felt it, did feel it, that impossible pull that made her want to step into his arms despite every rational thought in her head. "It doesn't matter," she said instead, backing away from him until her spine hit the cottage wall. "Even if it's true, even if there's something between us, it doesn't change anything. You're still a king, and I'm still nobody." "You're not—" He moved after her, close enough now that she was trapped between his body and the wall, close enough that she could see the desperate edge in his expression. God, Mira, you're everything. You're the reason I can't sleep, can't think, can't focus on anything but getting back to you. Stop saying that. But even as she protested, her hands were coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. It's the truth. His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing over her cheekbones with devastating tenderness. You saved my life, little healer, but more than that, you saved me. I'm scared, she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Scared of believing him, scared of wanting this, scared of the part of her that wanted to sink into his warmth and never leave. His entire expression softened, silver eyes going gentle and patient in a way that made her chest ache. Then we go slow, he murmured, echoing the words he had spoken that first night. I'm not leaving, Mira, not again. Your counsel can go to hell. The vehemence in his voice surprised her. I spent 3 weeks in political meetings, listening to them tell me who I should marry, who would make a suitable queen, and all I could think about was you. All I wanted was to come home. Home. The word hit her like a physical blow, sweet and terrifying in equal measure. This isn't your home, she said weakly, even as her treacherous body leaned into his touch. Isn't it? His forehead came down to rest against hers, and they stood there, breathing the same air, while the world narrowed to just this moment, this impossible connection between them. I've never felt at peace anywhere the way I feel in your cottage. I've never felt like I belong somewhere the way I belong here, with you. The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability, made tears burn behind her eyes. She wanted to believe him, wanted it so desperately it felt like drowning. They'll never accept me, she whispered. Your counsellors, your court. I'm common-born, I have magic, I'm everything they don't want in a queen. I don't care what they want. His hands tightened on her face, silver eyes blazing with something fierce and protective. I care what I want. I care what you want. What I want doesn't matter. It's the only thing that matters. He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, and she saw absolute certainty in his expression. Tell me what you want, Mira, not what you think is practical, not what you think is impossible. Tell me what you want. The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities that terrified her, because she knew what she wanted, had known since the moment he walked back into her garden. She wanted him. She wanted this impossible, dangerous, beautiful thing between them. I want you to stay, she whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in her chest. I want you to choose me over your crown, over your duty, over everything, and I'm scared because I know you can't. Watch me. The words were a promise, fierce and absolute. And then his mouth was on hers, claiming her with a desperation that spoke of 3 weeks of separation and a lifetime of wanting. She kissed him back helplessly, her hands fisting in his shirt as she poured all her fear and longing and impossible love into the connection between them. He tasted like coming home, like safety and passion and everything she had never dared to want. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers again. I'm not leaving, he said, the words a vow against her lips. Not this time, little healer, not ever again. And for the first time since he had walked out of her cottage 3 weeks ago, Mira allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, fairy tales could be real after all. The journey to Kieran's stronghold took 5 days, and they were the most terrifying and wonderful days of Mira's life. He had insisted she couldn't stay hidden in her cottage forever, not when his enemies were growing bolder, not when the council's rebellion threatened to spill into open conflict. She needed the protection of his palace, the safety of his guard, the security that only came with being publicly acknowledged as his. They'll take one look at me and know I don't belong, Mira said, as they made camp on the 3rd night, the capital's towers visible in the distance like a promise and a threat. You belong with me, Kieran replied simply, banking the small fire they had shared. That's all that matters. But as their small party approached the massive gates of his palace, as Mira saw the sheer scale of wealth and power that surrounded his daily life, she felt her courage faltering. The walls rose impossibly high, studded with silver banners that caught the morning light like captured stars. Guards in pristine armour lined the battlements, and everything spoke of a majesty she could barely comprehend. "Second thoughts?" Kieran asked quietly, his horse moving closer to hers as they passed through the outer gates. "Third and fourth thoughts," she admitted, trying not to stare at the servants who bowed as Kieran passed, trying not to notice the way their eyes lingered on her simple travelling dress with poorly concealed confusion. His hand found hers, warm and steady and reassuring. "Trust me, little healer. I won't let anything happen to you." The great hall of his palace was overwhelming in its grandeur. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadows high above, and tapestries depicting centuries of royal history covered walls that seemed to stretch forever. Mira had never felt smaller, never been more aware of her common blood and rough hands, and the mud still clinging to her boots. Servants bowed to her because she walked beside their king, but she could see the questions in their eyes. Who was she? Where had she come from? What was she doing at their master's side? "Your Majesty!" A man in elaborate robes approached with measured steps, his expression carefully neutral. "The council is waiting in the throne room. They're quite eager to discuss your extended absence." "Lord Chancellor," Kieran acknowledged with the barest nod. "They can wait a bit longer. I need to see my guest settled first." The Chancellor's eyes flicked to Mira, and she saw calculation there, assessment that made her skin crawl. "Of course, Your Majesty, though I should mention that the Council has some concerns about irregularities in your recent behaviour." "My behaviour is not the Council's concern." The edge of command in Kieran's voice made the Chancellor step back, but Mira caught the flash of satisfaction in the older man's eyes. This was exactly the kind of reaction he had been hoping for. The rooms Kieran gave her were larger than her entire cottage, with windows that overlooked gardens so beautiful they looked like something from a dream. A dozen servants appeared as if from nowhere to help her bathe, to bring her food, to lay out clothing that was clearly worth more than she had ever owned. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed to Kieran when he came to check on her an hour later. She gestured helplessly at the silk gown the servants had left, at the jewels laid out on the dressing table, like she was someone worthy of wearing them. "I don't know how to be the person they expect me to be." "Be yourself." He moved behind her, hands settling on her shoulders with gentle weight. "That's all I've ever wanted from you." "Myself isn't enough for this world." She met his eyes in the mirror, saw the way her simple features looked ordinary, next to his impossible beauty. "Look at me, Kieran. Really look at me. I'm nobody special." His reflection scowled, hands tightening on her shoulders. "Stop saying that." "It's true. I'm common born. I have magic that marks me as dangerous. I've lived like a hermit for 3 years. Your council is going to take one look at me and they're going to see exactly what I see." He turned her around to face him, silver eyes blazing with fierce certainty. "They're going to see the woman who saved their king's life. They're going to see strength and courage and a heart that's bigger than this entire palace. They're going to see a peasant who doesn't know which fork to use." The words came out more bitter than she intended, edged with all her fears and insecurities. "Then I'll teach you about forks." The simple statement, delivered with such matter-of-fact confidence, made her throat tight with emotion. "I'll teach you about court protocol and political manoeuvring and anything else you want to know. But Mira, you don't need to change who you are to belong here." Before she could respond, before she could voice any of the dozen protests rising in her throat, a commotion outside made them both freeze. Raised voices, the sound of running feet, and underneath it all, the metallic whisper of drawn steel. Kieran was moving before she could process what was happening, positioning himself between her and the door, with fluid grace that spoke of countless battles fought and won. "Stay behind me," he commanded, and something in his voice made her obey without question. The door burst open without ceremony, and a man in council robes strode in, flanked by armed guards. His face was flushed with anger, his eyes wild with something that looked dangerously close to fanaticism. "Lord Aldrich," Kieran said, his voice carrying deadly calm, "you forget yourself. This is a private chamber." "Private?" Aldrich's voice cracked with outrage. "There is no privacy when the realm itself is at stake, Your Majesty. We've discovered the truth about your guest." Mira's blood turned to ice in her veins. They had investigated her, had learned about her past, about her magic, about the village that had burned because people like her were considered too dangerous to live. "Have you?" Kieran's tone could have frozen flame. "And what truth is that?" "She's a mage." Aldrich spat the word like a curse. "A hedge witch with illegal magical abilities. She was present at the burning of Ravenshire 3 years ago, probably caused it herself." "I did not!" The protest tore from Mira's throat before she could stop it, but Aldrich's voice overrode hers. "Do you deny having magical abilities?" he demanded, eyes blazing with religious fervour. "Do you deny practising illegal magic?" The trap was perfect, inescapable. If she denied it, she would be lying, and they probably had proof. If she admitted it, she would be confessing to crimes that carried a death sentence. "I'm a healer," she said quietly, lifting her chin despite the terror clawing at her chest. "I use my abilities to help people." "Illegal magic is illegal magic," Aldrich declared triumphantly. "The law is clear, Your Majesty. This woman is a criminal who has corrupted your judgment through unnatural means." "Get out!" Kieran's voice was quiet, deadly, filled with the kind of authority that made kingdoms tremble. "Your Majesty, you must see—" "Get out!" The command cracked through the air like thunder, backed by an alpha's power that made every person in the room drop to their knees in instinctive submission. Every person except Mira, who stood frozen behind him as she watched the man she loved transform into something terrifying and magnificent. The guards scrambled to their feet and back toward the door, dragging the protesting Aldrich with them. But before they left, the councillor turned back with eyes full of malicious satisfaction. "The full council demands an explanation, Your Majesty, tonight, and they demand to see proof that this woman hasn't ensorcelled you with illegal magic." The door slammed behind them, leaving Mira and Kieran alone in the sudden silence. She could see the tension in his shoulders, could feel the barely contained rage radiating from him like heat from a forge. "They're right," she whispered, the words falling into the quiet like stones into still water. He turned to face her, and she saw something wild and desperate in his silver eyes. "They're not." "They are." She backed away from him, needing distance to think past the terror clawing at her throat. "I am exactly what they said I am. I have illegal magic. I was at Ravenshire when it burned. I am everything they fear." "You're innocent." The fierce certainty in his voice made her chest ache. "You ran from the hunters. You didn't cause the burning." "It doesn't matter what really happened." The political reality crashed over her like cold water, washing away the fantasy that love could conquer everything. "It matters what they can prove, what they can make people believe." "I won't let them hurt you." He moved toward her, hands outstretched, but she continued backing away until her spine hit the window. "You can't stop them." The words tasted like despair. "They're your counsel, your advisers. If they demand proof I haven't ensorcelled you, what are you going to tell them? The truth, that what's between us is real, that it has nothing to do with magic. And if they don't believe you?" She was crying now, tears streaming down her face as the full hopelessness of their situation crashed over her. "What happens when they demand I be executed as a dangerous mage? What happens when they use this as proof that you're unfit to rule?" His jaw clenched, and she saw him realise the trap they were in. By bringing her here, by publicly claiming her, he had given his enemies exactly the weapon they needed to destroy them both. I'm scared, she sobbed, all her composure crumbling as terror consumed her. I'm scared they're going to kill me. I'm scared they're going to use me to hurt you. I'm scared that trying to love you is going to destroy everything. His expression softened instantly, all the royal authority melting away to leave just the man who had held her through storms and promised to go slow. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, pulling her into his arms with desperate tenderness. "Then we go slow," he murmured against her hair, echoing the words that had become their promise. "We face this together and we go slow. I'm not leaving, little healer. No matter what they threaten, no matter what they demand, I'm not leaving you to face this alone." "You might not have a choice." The words were muffled against his chest, but she felt him stiffen at the implication. "There's always a choice." His arms tightened around her, fierce and protective, and absolutely certain. "And I choose you, Mira. I choose you over the crown, over the council, over everything. You need to know that." She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes, saw the truth of his words written in silver fire. He meant it. This powerful man, this king who could have anything he wanted, was choosing her. Despite the cost, despite the consequences, despite everything they stood to lose. "The council meeting tonight," she whispered. "What will you tell them?" His smile was sharp, predatory, filled with the kind of confidence that had built kingdoms. "I'm going to tell them exactly what you are to me. I'm going to tell them that you're my mate, my queen, my everything. And then I'm going to dare them to try to take you away from me." The promise in his voice, the absolute certainty that he would fight for her against impossible odds, made something in her chest settle into place. She was still terrified, still convinced this would end in disaster, but for the first time since the councillors had burst through the door, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe love couldn't conquer everything, but maybe, with the right man beside her, it could conquer enough. The throne room was packed when they arrived that evening, every member of the council present, along with what seemed like half the noble houses in the kingdom. Word had spread quickly through the palace that their king would finally address the rumours surrounding his mysterious absence and the peasant woman who had appeared at his side. Mira walked beside Kieran through the sea of staring faces, her hand resting in the crook of his arm as he had taught her during their hurried lesson in court etiquette. She wore the silk gown his servants had provided, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that made her look like someone else entirely. But she still felt every eye cataloguing her differences, her inadequacies. "Breathe," Kieran murmured, as they approached the dais where his throne waited, silver and imposing, and somehow perfectly suited to the man beside her. "Remember, you belong here because I say you do." The council members arrayed themselves in a semicircle before the throne, their faces carved from stone as they watched their king take his seat. Mira remained standing at his side, acutely aware that there was no chair for her, no place in this formal arrangement that acknowledged her existence. Lord Aldrich stepped forward, his robes rustling in the sudden silence. "Your Majesty, we have gathered tonight to address the concerns that have arisen regarding your recent behaviour and the individual you have brought into our court." "Her name is Mira," Kieran said quietly, but his voice carried to every corner of the vast room. "And she is not an individual. She is my mate." A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembled crowd. Mira felt her cheeks burn as hundreds of eyes fixed on her with new interest, new calculation. Mate. He had said it publicly now, in front of witnesses, making it impossible to take back. "Your Majesty," another councillor spoke up, a thin man with cold eyes who stepped forward with predatory grace. "We have conducted investigations into this woman's background. The results are troubling." "Then share them," Kieran commanded, though Mira could feel the tension radiating from him like heat. "Mira Thornwick," the councillor announced, consulting a scroll with theatrical precision. "Daughter of executed magical practitioners, survivor of the Ravenshire burning, and herself a practitioner of illegal magical arts." The words hit the crowd, like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples of shock and fear through the assembled nobles. Mira heard whispered conversations, saw hands moving to protective amulets, watched as people subtly shifted away from her as if her very presence might contaminate them. "The law is clear," Lord Aldrich declared, his voice rising with righteous fervour. "Magic users are enemies of the realm, corrupters of natural order. This woman has clearly used her illegal abilities to ensorcel our king, to bend his will to her own purposes." "That's not true," Mira said, the words torn from her throat before she could stop them. Her voice sounded small in the vast space, but it carried nonetheless. "I never used magic on him. I would never—" "Silence!" Aldrich's command cracked like a whip. "You have no voice in these proceedings, witch!" The word hung in the air like a curse, and Mira felt something inside her chest crumble at the hatred in his tone. She had known this would happen, had prepared herself for their rejection, but the reality was somehow worse than her worst fears. "You will not speak to her that way." Kieran's voice was deadly quiet, filled with the kind of controlled fury that made kingdoms tremble. He rose from his throne with fluid grace, and suddenly the room felt smaller, more dangerous. "You will show proper respect to your future queen." "Queen!" Lord Aldrich's voice cracked with outrage. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot be serious. This woman is everything that is forbidden, everything that threatens our way of life." "This woman," Kieran said, moving to stand beside Mira with protective intensity, "saved my life. This woman showed me kindness when I was a stranger bleeding at her door. This woman has more courage and honour than anyone in this room." "She has corrupted your judgment." Another councillor stepped forward, his face flushed with desperation. "Can't you see what she's done to you? You were a strong leader, a man who put duty above personal desires. Now you abandon your responsibilities, disappear for weeks, threaten the stability of the realm, all for a peasant witch." "I choose her," Kieran said simply, and the quiet certainty in his voice made the entire room fall silent. "I choose her over duty, over politics, over the approval of people who would see her burn for the crime of being born different." "And if we refuse to accept her?" Lord Aldrich demanded. "If the council declares this union invalid?" Kieran's smile was sharp, predatory, filled with the kind of dangerous confidence that had built his kingdom. "Then you can find yourselves a new king." The silence that followed was deafening. Mira felt the weight of every stare, heard the whispered conversations starting up around the edges of the crowd. He had done it. He had publicly chosen her over his crown, had thrown down a challenge that would reshape the entire political landscape of the realm. "You would abandon your people for this woman?" The question came from an older councillor, his voice heavy with disappointed disbelief. "I would abandon people who think my personal happiness threatens their safety," Kieran replied. "I would abandon advisors who believe fear should guide every decision we make." "She practices illegal magic." Aldrich's voice was nearly a shriek now, his composure cracking under the pressure of losing his political gambit. "She is dangerous, unnatural, a threat to everything we stand for." "She is a healer." Kieran's hand found Mira's, warm and steady and anchoring. "She uses her gifts to help people, to save lives, to make the world a little bit kinder than she found it." "That is not for her to decide." Another voice rose from the crowd. "Magic is illegal because it's dangerous, because people like her caused the wars that nearly destroyed our ancestors." "People like her," Kieran repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "are people, citizens of this realm who deserve protection, not persecution." Mira felt tears burning behind her eyes as she listened to him defend her, as she watched him risk everything for the right to love her openly. But she also saw the faces around them, saw the fear and hatred and religious fervour that his words were only inflaming. "This is wrong," she whispered, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. "This is going to tear your kingdom apart." "No," he said firmly, squeezing her hand with gentle strength. This is going to force my kingdom to be better than it's ever been before." Lord Aldrich stepped forward again, his face twisted with fury and desperation. "Your Majesty, if you insist on this madness, if you refuse to see reason, then the council has no choice but to—" He never finished the sentence. A crossbow bolt sprouted from his chest like a deadly flower, and he crumpled to the marble floor with a look of shocked surprise. Screams erupted from the crowd as more bolts flew from the gallery above, cutting down nobles and councillors with mechanical precision. Assassins. The same ones who had tried to kill Kieran in the forest, now striking at the heart of his power when he was most vulnerable. "Mira, get down!" Kieran shoved her behind his throne as chaos erupted around them. Guards poured into the room, steel rang against steel, and the smell of blood began to fill the air. She crouched behind the massive chair, hands pressed to her mouth to muffle her terrified sobs as the sounds of battle raged around her. This was her fault. Her presence had divided his council, had created the weakness his enemies needed to strike. A shadow fell across her hiding place, and she looked up to see a man in black leather pointing a crossbow at her heart. His face was covered by a mask, but his eyes were cold and pitiless. "The witch dies tonight," he said, finger tightening on the trigger. Time slowed to crystal clarity. Mira saw the bolt release, saw it flying toward her chest with deadly accuracy. And something inside her, some power she had never fully understood, exploded outward like a golden wave. The bolt stopped in midair, suspended by invisible force. The assassin's eyes widened in shock, then in agony, as his own wounds began appearing on his body. Shallow cuts that deepened, bruises that darkened, broken bones that snapped with audible cracks. He fell screaming, his crossbow clattering harmlessly to the floor. Mira stared at her hands in horror. She had done that. Her healing magic, reversed and twisted by terror, had turned her into exactly the kind of weapon people feared. "Mira!" Kieran appeared at her side, silver eyes wild with concern as he pulled her against his chest. "Are you hurt?" She couldn't answer, couldn't do anything but shake as she stared at the man writhing on the floor, dying from wounds that should have been hers. Around them, the sounds of battle were fading as the last of the assassins fell to the royal guard. "I killed him," she whispered against Kieran's chest. "I used my magic to kill him." "You defended yourself," he said fiercely, arms tightening around her with protective intensity. "You did what you had to do to survive." "They were right about me." The words tasted like poison. "I am dangerous. I am exactly what they said I was." "You are exactly what you've always been." He pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands, silver eyes blazing with fierce certainty. "You are brave and kind and strong. You are the woman who saved a stranger's life, who showed mercy to someone who didn't deserve it." "I'm scared," she sobbed, the familiar words falling from her lips like a prayer. "I'm scared of what I am. I'm scared of what they'll think. I'm scared that being with me will destroy everything you've built." His expression softened instantly, all the royal authority melting away to leave just the man who had promised to go slow, who had sworn he would never leave. "Then we go slow," he murmured against her forehead, the words a benediction in the midst of chaos. "We learn about your power together. We face the fear together. And I'm not leaving, little healer. Not now, not ever." Around them, the throne room was beginning to clear as guards removed bodies and servants appeared with mops and buckets. The political crisis that had brought them here seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the very real threat they had just survived. "The council," Mira whispered, remembering the confrontation that felt like it had happened years ago instead of minutes. "Can find new leadership," Kieran said firmly. "Half of them were traitors anyway, working with the assassins to destabilize the realm." She pulled back to look at him, seeing new lines of weariness around his silver eyes. What happens now? His smile was tired but genuine, filled with the kind of quiet confidence that had made her fall in love with him. "Now we rebuild. We find counsellors who believe in protecting all citizens, not just the ones who look like them. We create a kingdom where people like you are valued instead of hunted. And us? The question was barely a whisper. Us, he said, lifting her left hand to press a gentle kiss to her palm. We get married, tonight if you'll have me, tomorrow if you need more time to think about it. The proposal, delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty in the aftermath of violence and political upheaval, made her laugh despite everything. You want to marry me after watching me kill someone with magic? I want to marry you because you're you, he said simply, because you're brave enough to defend yourself, strong enough to use power you've never understood, kind enough to worry about the consequences of protecting your own life. I'm still scared, she admitted, though the terror was beginning to fade into something more manageable. Good, he said, pulling her closer. Being scared means you're alive, and being alive with you is all I've ever wanted. Later, much later, after the dead had been cleared away and new guards had been posted and emergency council sessions had been held, Mira found herself in Kieran's private chambers, wearing a simple white gown and holding a bouquet of herbs from her own garden. The ceremony was small, witnessed only by a handful of loyal guards and the palace chaplain, who seemed more interested in getting back to his dinner than in protesting the unusual marriage. But when Kieran took her hands and promised to love her through fear and magic and whatever else the world might throw at them, when she promised to stay and trust and let herself be treasured, it felt like the most important moment in the history of the realm. My queen, he whispered against her lips after the chaplain pronounced them bound. My king, she whispered back, and for the first time since she had learned his true identity, the title felt like an endearment instead of a barrier. They spent their wedding night in quiet conversation, sharing dreams and fears and plans for the kingdom they would build together. And when Mira finally fell asleep in her husband's arms, surrounded by luxury she was still learning to accept, the golden warmth in her chest had settled into something steady and sure. She was still scared sometimes, but she was no longer alone in her fear, and somehow that made all the difference in the world.